Well, hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here at this webinar organized by Britcham, Brazil. I'm Paula Vitelli, I'm president at Britcham, and I will take these first few minutes for a few words and speaking about the chamber and also thanking those who are going to be with us this morning for this session. First, I'd like to mention about Britcham's mission. We are here to support bilateral business between Brazil and the UK by creating diverse, inclusive, prosperous, and sustainable businesses and social environments that serve our members and help drive growth in trade, industry, services, and investment. The chamber is, we have offices in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Paraná, and Minas Gerais. And being part of the chamber is becoming part of a network of high decision-making executives in Brazil and in the UK. With the new UK ambassador in Brazil, Mrs. Stephanie Alcac, and the new Brazilian federal government, Britcham is working further this year to bring stakeholders and associates companies closer together. This is one of the events where we bring such interests together. And in this case, by being a relevant forum for debates between members and also the public sector in different areas. Britcham's committees, our industrials and sectoral committees and discussion groups develop activities in several fronts and opportunities. And this webinar today is led by the Risks and Insurance Committee. To learn more about our committees, please visit our website at www.britcham.com.br. Then I would like to thank first to Britcham's supporting members whose brands have been widely publicized just before we actually started the session in the open slide of the session. Then I would like to thank to Marta Shu and Marcia Cicarelli, who will be moderating this event. They are president and vice president of Britcham's Risk and Insurance Committee. Then I would also like to thank to our speakers for this session from Contra Risks, Claudine and Nicolas Reys, both partners at Contra Risks, and Leandro Lima, senior analyst, for bringing this very relevant content to our audience this morning. RiskMap is a traditional and important report produced by Contra Risks that brings an analysis of the conjuncture risks for Brazil and the world during the year. As today's speakers will go through the 2023 RiskMap, this year's challenge reinforced the importance of cybersecurity and regulatory measures, including the Brazilian tax reform and carbon credit market. Those are going to be viewed across, but those topics are actually looked at across the board by Britcham and our committees and will be closely monitored by us, especially with the start of the new government in Brazil. So topics, very relevant topics to the chamber that we're going to be covering this morning in this session. I will then stop for now, and then I'll pass this on to Marcia Cicarelli, who will then be leading the session. Thank you very much for your attention and hope you enjoy the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana Paula. Thank you very much for opening this event. It's a pleasure to be here in a very important event about RiskMap. As Ana Paula said, my name is Marcia Cicarelli. I am Vice President of the Risks and Insurance Committee, together with Marta Shu, that unfortunately cannot be here today, who is the President of the committee. I'm also the partner of insurance at Demarest. So thank you very much, first of all, to Contra Risks for putting together this very important event today, and also to our speakers and to the audience that it is here with us today. So just to give a little bit of housekeeping, so how this webinar is going to be working today, we are being streamed live through Zoom and also YouTube. And we'll have 3 speakers presentations today. And after each speaker, we'll have questions by the insurance committee. I will also be taking note of the questions from the audience. So who wants to make questions, please do so through the Q&A button in your Zoom. If possible, please put your name and company so that I can speak that out when I throw the questions to our speakers today. Depending on the time, because we have some time constraint here, it may be that we're not able to put all the questions to the speakers today. We'll be ending at 11 a.m. But I will try to reply them in writing if not possible to address them today. And after this first introduction, I would like to quickly introduce our speakers today. So we're having Claudine Fry. Claudine is a partner at Control Risks. She designs and manages consulting engagements for Control Risks clients with a particular interest in political risk in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Claudine has a remit to build Control Risks retainer business through which their clients have access to bespoke intelligence and analysis on a long-term, on-demand, and flexible basis. Claudine works across the business with colleagues in technology, cyber, corporate investigations, and security consulting to deliver innovative solutions for clients with an interest in identifying, monitoring, and treating political, security, reputational, and operational risks at a tactic or strategic level. We'll also be having, after Claudine, Nicolas Reys. Nicolas is the partner leading Control Risk Cyber Americas and Global Threat Intelligence Practices. Nicolas is responsible for the management and coordination of global teams and of threat intelligence and cybersecurity consultants. He specializes in the provision of threat intelligence to public and private sector organizations, as well as leading and delivering complex threat intelligence and security projects. Nicolas regularly advises Fortune 100 executives on digital transformation, cybersecurity, emerging technology risks, and threat intelligence matters. And finally, we'll have Leandro Lima, who is a senior analyst for Brazil and the Southern Cone for Global Risk Analysis. Control Risk's market-leading political, operational, and security risk analysis and forecasting team is based in São Paulo. Leandro contributes to Control Risk online monitoring services called CORE and has a conduct tailored analysis for multinational clients across the region. Leandro holds an MSc in political science and a BA in international relations from the University of São Paulo. Prior to joining Control Risks, he worked in government affairs for the food and beverage industry and for a public affairs firm, in which he supported clients in a range of sectors, such as the healthcare industry. So I don't have to say what is a great pleasure to hear our speakers today. So with no more delay, I would like to pass the word to Claudine Fry, who will be presenting the top risks, geopolitical, operational, and regulatory on our risk map today. Thank you, Claudine.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that warm introduction. We're absolutely delighted to be with you all today and to have an opportunity to share our top risks for 2023. We always look forward to pulling these together and presenting them, and we do genuinely welcome your view as well, your questions and your input into how the world looks and feels to you and what you think your biggest concerns, challenges and opportunities are going to be for the year ahead. So please do feel free to share them during the course of this session. So we start with our top geopolitical risk. If we could go on to that slide, please. Thank you. And I think there really is no other place to start, actually, because the geopolitical environment is so turbulent and transitory and uncertain at the moment. And it really is providing a driver and shaping and influencing all the other risks that we will talk about today. So bear this geopolitical environment in mind as you consider the security, the regulatory, the cyber, and the other issues that we're going to talk through today, because it informs and drives every single one of them. You might have heard the words polycrisis or perhaps permacrisis. they've become very popular this year. And I think that's because of the geopolitical environment. It's what's giving us all this sense that we are living through a period of history which is really troublesome, that we are lurching from one crisis to another, or perhaps this feeling that we are managing multiple crises at once. And in 2023, the geopolitical issue that we think we all need to be watching closely is US-China. Now, that is not because we're anticipating a conflict over Taiwan, although certainly questions around the status of Taiwan long term are important to be thinking about even now, but because there are so many ways that this relationship is playing out, which have very tangible business relevant implications wherever you are and whatever you are doing. China is coming out of COVID. It needs to reassert itself on the world stage as an economic and diplomatic and a military powerhouse. And it needs to get that economy going again. The growth has been very disappointing recently. We also have the US coming into a new presidential election cycle, elections, of course, scheduled there for 2024. And with China as one of the few issues upon which all sides of the political spectrum can find some area of agreement. And there's a huge pressure on any government in Washington at the moment to be tough, to be seen as tough on China. So from the US, we will see a continued focus on onshoring, on encouraging domestic production, on basically reducing the reliance of the US economy, its businesses, to potentially unreliable third parties. So shoring up its access to raw materials around the world. And on the China side, similarly, a big focus on how it can make sure it can protect its national self-sufficiency and try and develop much more sophistication at the high end of manufacturing, developing domestic innovation and sophisticated products and services across sectors, but particularly in those which are particularly strategically significant. So two countries locked in a battle for supremacy on the global stage, locked in a battle for national self-sufficiency, and perceiving themselves as being somewhat mutually exclusive. One or the other ultimately has to succeed, and they're pursuing this competitive relationship by and large in the trade and military trade space. And we've seen that obviously dating back into the Trump administration as well, and most recently from the US Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. But we're going to start seeing this flexing of muscles, this competition between the US and China, stretching into the military and diplomatic sphere across the course of 2023. We've already seen lots of examples of that already, even by March. We had the balloon incident in the US a few weeks ago, giving us an insight into the kind of surveillance activities that China is undertaking in the Americas, of course. But we've also seen the US reviving some long old relationships in particularly in Asia, Southeast Asia, the Philippines, for example, reviving those military relationships. And of course, China will be watching all that very, very closely. And this relationship, as I said at the start, it matters no matter where you are, because the way this relationship unfolds will influence the ability of different countries around the world to access markets. It will influence the way that regulatory environments and sanctions regimes evolve and the way that they're enforced. It impacts supply chains globally. And this relationship is also feeding a fragmentation globally, which is making it much harder for us to find multinational agreements to international problems, such as climate change or maybe even the next pandemic as well. So our top geopolitical risk is that US-China relationship. And bear in mind that all the things that we felt as a consequence of Ukraine over the past year, whether that's in the form of the way that migration flows and people movement has taken place, in the terms of disruption to commodities, shortages, rocketing prices, trade embargoes, and so on, or thinking about supply chains being reimagined or sanctions regimes, all of those effects and impacts of the Ukraine conflict would be felt many, many, many times over in the event of a serious deterioration in the US-China relationship. So it's one that we'll all need to be watching very closely across this year, but actually also thinking beyond into the next coming decades as well. I will move on now to the next operating risk, please. And this one is focused on shining a spotlight on energy. Now, we are talking here about an energy market which has been profoundly changed as a consequence of the Ukraine conflict. Particularly, of course, the most direct and immediate consequence of Ukraine in terms of its impact on the energy market is ending Russia's relationship with Western Europe, changing the status completely of Russia as a supplier of energy for particularly the European Union. That is something we don't see as being reversed, at least for a generation. But of course, the consequences of that change are being felt globally as Russia looks for alternative buyers, as Europe joins the competitive space looking for alternative suppliers, and so on. And companies are having to navigate through this very, very different energy and the very different and dynamic and evolving energy markets, and think about energy security at the same time, of course, as they're navigating another profound energy related challenge, and that is, of course, energy transition. It is going to be really an acute challenge for companies across this year to be answering those fundamental questions. How resilient are your sources of energy? And then, as a linked question, how compliant are your arrangements around sourcing energy with your commitments on ESG and energy transition? They are going to be very difficult and different questions to answer simultaneously for companies around the world. Competition for energy is going to be tight this year. This is partly because of that consequence of the Ukraine conflict on the market. We've got China and India and other middle powers, of course, including in Brazil and the Americas region, who are flexing their diplomatic and growing status globally and competing for sources of energy. Here in Europe, we have escaped an energy crisis this winter, partly because the weather has been comparatively mild, but that might not be the case next year. And we're already detecting quite a bit of concern among organizations here about their readiness for next winter, 2023, 2024, and how well governments will be able to prepare for that when they're competing with China and other countries globally for sources of energy which are compliant with their geopolitical or energy transition commitments. But with climate change feeling ever more urgent and real, energy transition is not going anywhere. And in fact, it has been forecast by some other organizations that the Ukraine conflict has actually accelerated energy transition by 5 to 10 years. BP's just come out with one of its sort of landmark annual reports, and in all the scenarios that it puts forward for how the world will evolve, fossil fuels are still going to be collapsing as a proportion of overall energy use by 2050 to around a fifth. So no matter the fact there have been various governments backtracking on energy transition in the wake of Ukraine and the need to meet near-term energy security commitments, we are on a path which is not going to be reversed and which is gaining pace all the time. And we certainly feel that the commitments the corporate world has made to energy transition are now deeply embedded into processes, into culture, into a sense of companies' purpose and value and role in the world. So we don't see those as going anywhere, and they will have to be aligned with how companies are securing supplies. But of course, energy transition in itself is a disruptive and destabilizing process in the near term, which will be one of the factors that feeds into that geopolitical turbulence that we were talking about, adjusting the status of different countries globally, impacting on the different access that companies and countries have to markets around the world. So that is our top operating risk for 2023. And I will move on now to our top regulatory risk, which is linked to a macroeconomic environment, which is, and I think this applies everywhere, more troubling, at least when it comes to inflation than it has been for at least a generation. So we have governments around the world who are grappling with tough financial circumstances, challenges around the cost of living, around debt, around how to stimulate growth long-term, and grapple with profound changes to economies and societies that are being ushered in as technology evolves, as climate change forces us to think about new ways of doing things. We are also post-pandemic living through a period of history where governments of all kinds, whether they're liberal democracies, whether they're more authoritarian, feeling a degree of comfort intervening in our lives, intervening in markets, which wasn't the case in 2019. So there is a degree of comfort that governments have intervening to achieve objectives and not fearing the backlash of doing that. And I think that will influence the way we see governments behaving as they seek to shore up finances and protect and try and stimulate growth in their national economies. Their credit is tight internationally. We have so many different countries already in talks with the IMF or having secured funds recently, thinking about the likes of Ghana, of Bangladesh, of Pakistan, of Sri Lanka, of Egypt. There are countries closer to home in Latin America, of course, as well, which are facing very difficult financial circumstances. So this regulatory risk is thinking about how might governments behave in a way that impacts us as businesses. That might be directly in the form of tax changes, tax rises, or changes to the taxation system. It might be in the form of new trade deals, which change access to a market, subsidies or preferential treatment. It might be in the form of changes to customs arrangement and trade and border controls. In some cases, it might also be that the government response has an indirect impact on companies, on the corporate world. This might be, for example, because we've seen a number of different governments already this year trying to shield the corporate world from the impact of policies that they are introducing to stimulate growth and boost state finances. But although they are avoiding taxing business, and they might, for example, be taxing consumers instead, they are scrutinizing what governments are doing. So they are, for example, checking that rules on tax or on subsidies or on access to preferential treatment in free trade zones, for example, those sorts of initiatives, that the rules are being enforced appropriately. So companies can expect more scrutiny, perhaps even if they're not the target of specific policy moves. But companies might also feel the impact indirectly of policy moves, because the way that governments respond to difficult macroeconomic conditions will have implications for stability, for levels of unrest, for the stability of a particular government and the time frame before there might be an election coming on. So there's a variety of ways which regulatory risk will manifest as a consequence of the macroeconomic environment and have an impact on us as businesses around the world. Okay, I'm going to wrap there, and I'm happy to take questions now. Marcia, over to you.
Thank you, Claudine. That was amazing. I was quite impressed and a bit afraid of the government intervention, what we can expect. Oh, well, I have a couple of questions, but there was one question from the audience that I think it is very pertinent. So I would like to put that forward. Yeah. So that's from Ricardo Sunderman, and he says, the political analyst Peter Zeihan sees that China already is moving down as an economic power, mostly because its demographic future. It means the nation is getting old and with less people. The US is a producer of food and energy, can look at a brighter future. Claudine, would you agree with that view? And what is your view for the next 10, 20 years in terms of this competition between China and US? I know it's a hard one.
Yeah. So demographic pressures, that is a really, really good question. And I have to tell you that that we have a lot of client conversations where we are talking about, what is keeping you up at night? What are the big things that could disrupt your business in the future? And we might talk about China, and we might talk about Ukraine, or we might talk about energy transition. perhaps as activism. And then often I find at the moment that there is this moment we turn to people, and the challenge of talent. So at a company level, I think this is really quite a profound challenge that we sort of underestimate sometimes. We're all grappling with it in the near term and the long term. So I think, yes, this is a really important thing to be thinking about. Are we going to be able to find the talent that we need in the places where we need it? Where are the markets where there is going to be a surplus of labor, if any? I think India is one of the only places globally, for example, that is actually forecast to have a surplus of manufacturing labor within the next 10 years. There is an extraordinary demographic change taking place globally, and a difficulty with ensuring that there is enough training around for skills to actually be available, particularly when it comes to the digital economy and the sorts of digital technology literate people that we're going to need in all sorts of functions, across sectors, across economies, and where are we going to find them? So I think, this is a problem for the US, but it's also a problem elsewhere. It's a problem for China in particular. It's one of the key reasons why there is actually some skepticism about China's long-term growth prospects, because ultimately China is also facing very significant demographic challenges linked to the birth rate and also linked to urban-rural ratios of the population. So I think demographics at a macro level, yes, hugely significant to be engaged with, agree they're a significant challenge for the US. And then at a micro level, thinking within our organizations, are we equipped to think through, have we really thought through how we're going to find the people that we need in the future? What sort of training will we as companies be expected to provide, because it hasn't been provided by an education system or by a state in the future, to take people on and train them and give them the skills that we need? Are we anticipating having our manufacturing in country X in the next 10 years? And is that actually sensible given the range of skills and talent that is available in country X? On the other hand, there are also migration pressures. We're expecting climate change, for example, to be a huge driver of migration in the future. And so that will support demographic trends in some countries, but of course that requires governments being in an appropriate mindset and politically able to facilitate policy making and the integration of migrant communities in ways that actually support economic growth. So I think, yes, a really, really good question, and lots to unpack around that issue. China-US, long term, this is a relationship that is going to continue to be by far and away the most significant driver of the overall geopolitical environment. In our view, we actually are relatively optimistic. We think that we are heading into a new geopolitical environment. It's settling, it's starting to settle into place, I think, where we will have blocks of states which are aligned with China, some with the US, and then a lot of middle powers, as they're often being called at the moment, the likes of Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, which are non-aligned or neutral or have relationships across the geopolitical fault lines, and they are influential and significant in their own right. So it's not a world in which we're heading into a sharply divided world in two directions, one China, one US. In our view, there will still be ways of operating across blocks and between the US and China, but the way that companies will do that will have to change quite significantly as a consequence of the different approaches US, China, and other countries take to regulating cyberspace, regulating data privacy, and so on. And Nick will talk more about this. So we see the US-China relationship as being key driver of the geopolitical environment, unlikely to improve anytime soon, but not destabilizing to the point where we have a serious conflict and war over Taiwan on our hands. I think it is also worth reflecting on the outlook for Taiwan, as I mentioned at the beginning, in the very long term, 10, 20 years more, but bearing in mind that the US and other countries are readying themselves now to be in a position to reduce their reliance on what's happening in Northeast Asia for microchips and raw materials and so on. So I think the geopolitical environment and the positions of the US and China may change markedly in the future, and we shouldn't draw too many assumptions or be too alarmist about what we expect to happen with respect to that relationship.
Thank you, Claudine. That was quite interesting. I would like to make just one further question before we move on to Nicolas, just for us to have time for everybody to speak. About Ukrainian war, I think that is also a topic that it is of great interest and great concern for all of us. So how do you see the global impact on that? Not about the points already raised, especially about energy. And also, do you see any specific impact on Brazil, like considering we are a little bit more far away from that?
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about Ukraine at the moment is that we essentially, unfortunately, don't see that conflict as being resolved anytime soon. It's going to be protracted. It's going to, unfortunately, I think, start to feel like a normal, I think we've all become a bit more numb to seeing headlines about Ukraine, right? They don't have the same impact when we see them anymore, sadly. And I think we need to stay really alert to that, because I think that's a threat in itself. When something starts to feel, we stop taking any notice of it, but actually it's still incredibly impactful for us all. So keep an eye on it, because of the impact it has globally, not only in terms of its impact on commodities, but also the way that it is, I think, having it will have a legacy long-term on geopolitics and on the status of countries around the world, particularly India and China. But I think there is enormous scope for other countries too to be playing a role ultimately in its resolution, because of their status in agricultural supply chains, or on shipping routes, because of their strategic significance. So I think we will see ultimately, that this is going to be an issue which is on the shoulders of Europe to resolve ultimately, and to carry the costs of solving, I think, long term. But I think we'll see really interesting parts played by other countries around the world. And Brazil is, I think, a good example of one of those. I think the fact that, there will be countries where all sides to the conflict will want to continue having very meaningful trade relationships, diplomatic relationships, and those countries are points of communication, potentially, and negotiation, and they can provide channels through which the parties to the conflict can communicate. We don't anticipate, although we see sanctions continuing to be a really key part of the way the West is responding to what's happening in Ukraine, we don't see it likely that they will move towards making it more difficult, for example, for fertilizers to be exported, which of course have been protected and are critical in Brazil. So I think the trading relationships that have been protected so far will continue to be. We expect the sanctions regimes to be evolving in other ways. But one of the ways that sanctions will evolve is with secondary sanctions being a growing focus. And so I think for companies in Brazil and elsewhere, that's something important to bear in mind, because it's just becoming increasingly difficult, particularly when you're operating in lots of different markets, to keep monitoring, to keep an eye on where there might be an exposure to sanctions through a third party, through secondary sanctions. So I think thinking about sanctions, thinking about supply chains, and thinking about, but also thinking about the fact that different geopolitical players will have an interesting role to play, particularly where they are able to have a channel into different parties to the conflict over the long term.
Yes, and I think for insurance sanctions is a big deal. We are finding in a few cases, such as aviation, for instance, problems with sanctions that had a direct impact on insurance business and insurance indemnification.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what we've also, and I'm sure you found this as well, there's it's becoming more difficult to track because sanctions are incredibly complex. But also, I think there's a fear around sanctions, isn't there? And sometimes they're little understood. So there can be a fear of engaging in perfectly lawful transactions, but not wanting to pursue them because of the fear of sanctions, even though there was no actual reason not to pursue a particular opportunity or a particular transaction. So yeah, there's a lot of misunderstanding and complexity to wade through.
Yes, and cyber is also a big issue for sanction, and I would have many other questions, Claudine, but considering the time, I think I'll pass the word to Nicolas, who is going to speak exactly about cyber and security, which I think it is also a major concern for everybody, for all the companies today. So Nicolas, over to you.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you, Claudine. I think this was a very good overview of where we are in the world today, and certainly to the point that you raised at the very beginning, and even when we're thinking about sanctions or if we're thinking about the geopolitical environment, the cyber environment in the world that we live in today is both influenced and influences all of the dynamics that we talked about and that Claudine ran us through. So what we're forecasting in 2023, and this is a bit of a provocative title, is really the beginning of the end of global technology networks that our organizations have been relying upon over the past decades in order to build seamless connectivity across the board. And I think just on the slide front, we're a couple of slides behind. If you can move forward to a couple of slides, there we go. So we are fundamentally forecasting the real beginning of the collapse of global networks on which all of our organizations have been relying upon for the past 10 to 20 or 30 years even, where we have been able to integrate technologies that were emanating from a range of countries around the world, the innovation that was developed in one part of the world and deployed in completely other parts of the world, and fundamentally the very protocols on which the internet and its enabling technologies, whether those be subsea cable, satellite networks, or telecommunications network across every one country in the world, is starting to collapse, and its ability to interact with other jurisdictions. And this is fundamentally driven by two competing and certainly interlinked dynamics that have been ongoing for longer than since 2022, 2023, but are fundamentally accelerating in the years ahead. And those two competing priorities are, first and foremost, the increasing investment and the rapid post-pandemic acceleration in digital investments by every government and by every organizations around the world. We forecast that by 2023, the end of the year, more than 60% of the world's GDP will be digitalized. And the ecosystem that supports this digitalization, cyberspace, the internet, telecommunication networks, will itself be increasingly exposed to a number of risks, and fundamentally transfer these risks to the organizations, the people, and the governments that leverage this ecosystem in order to carry out their business or even their daily lives. The second dynamic tied to this is a sharp acceleration in what is rapidly becoming a cyber arms race in 2023. And I will touch on briefly on the impact of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, but certainly the lessons learned from most governments on the back of the invasion of Ukraine was that hybrid warfare, which had been talked about around the world, was now a clear reality, and that cyber attacks would systematically, or at least either predate or accompany physical military interventions in the future. And these two competing priorities are creating a real change in the way most governments and most organizations are starting to think about their own networks. So when we look at, first of all, the national reactions, which has been something that's been ongoing, but by 2023, more than 75% of the world's population will be covered by a national data protection regime, and certainly beyond 2023. And we've seen this in Brazil for the past few years now with LGPD and data protection regulation being in place in the country. We forecast that beyond 2023, the attention will move away from data to system focused cybersecurity regulations and legislation that is certainly tied to a lot of the recent discussions that you may have all heard or you have been involved in on how do we develop and implement artificial intelligence in our companies, how do we leverage 5G networks and now 6G networks across our economies and our governments and our countries in order to truly maximize the opportunities of this technological advancements. But the reaction has been one of control by many states who have looked back at the past 20 to 30 years of technological developments and have realized how far behind they had been. There were some notable exceptions to this, and China is another example of a government that for a long time has considered their cyberspace as a sovereign territory, and certainly that has imposed a number of restrictions both on business and individuals operating in that territory. And certainly we're expecting to see more and more of these. The US is now looking very concretely at some federal level regulations, and the White House's National Cybersecurity Strategy, which was published just about a week ago, is very, very clear on the criticality of cyberspace and cybersecurity to the overall security, but also to the resilience of infrastructure and business environments across the country. And this is the reality in which we live in. The digital investments that all of our organizations have made have created an entirely new set of risks that, although we have been dealing with cyber attacks historically, are changing very radically as we move towards increasing automation, as we move towards less and less human intervention in the way we leverage technology. We are exposing our organizations to more and more risks. The arms race that I mentioned just a little bit earlier was very, very evident at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, and certainly many organizations, including in Brazil, have contended with ransomware operations where criminal groups would encrypt data and systems in order to extort their victims for money. We certainly expect a resurgence of the ransomware ecosystem that refocused a lot of its attention at the beginning of the Ukraine war on either side of the conflict. But we do expect also a growing democratization of ransomware operators and the technology available to, even thanks to ChatGPT today, where code can be written by non-technical folks, and we see a huge boom in the development of the cyber criminal underground. We expect more and more countries to be systematically targeted, and we expect national level criminal groups to emerge. Brazil has had historically a couple of organized cyber criminal groups that work very effectively. And we do anticipate, and this goes back partly to a question on demographics that Claudine mentioned, we do anticipate, particularly in market and in economies where the demographic curve is young and where economic challenges can be more present in younger population, to see a growing underground ecosystem for cyber criminality. On the state side, we certainly have seen, and I mentioned the concept of hybrid warfare, a real investment in destructive capabilities by nation state operators to target critical infrastructure of foreign adversaries. And again, at the very beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, and this was a question that many asked, is why didn't we see this large scale cyber attack that would take down the entirety of the Ukraine networks? First of all, it wasn't in Russia's interest to do so, but secondly, the reaction by NATO and the very clear delineation that a cyber attack would now constitute a reason for potential military escalation really set the new scene in which all of our organizations are going to be operating. And Marcia, you mentioned insurance earlier and sanctions. I think this is another radical transformation that we've noticed in 2022 and that we expect to become the norm in 2023. The cost of cybercrime, but also the growing politicization of technology in our world today means that insurance companies are fundamentally struggling to understand and to be able to cover what is forecasted by 2026 to be the cyber criminal ecosystem is forecasted to be the equivalent of the third largest economy in the world. And the sanctions regimes that we have seen on the back of the invasion of Ukraine, including the sanctions of technology providers from operating in Russia, is really setting the scene for what 2023 will be, which is for organizations around the world a need to reconceptualize the way we identify, procure and implement technology in our organizations. No longer can we rely on a single provider for cloud security or a single provider for infrastructure, for even our laptops, if we operate in multiple jurisdictions. Tomorrow, there will be a very specific technology stack in China. There will be a very specific technology stack available to companies in the US, in Europe. Tomorrow, there will be restrictions on which AI applications can be used in China, in Europe, and in the US. And before handing over, and I think Leandro can give us a very good view of the Brazil-specific view, I want to go back to the point that Claudine mentioned about Brazil's position in all of this. Brazil has significantly invested in the past couple of years in its digital transformation, in funding startups, and in accelerating the domestic capability of technology as a sector to support the Brazilian economy. I think part of the challenge ahead will be that although there is no clear choice between the US and China, there is such a deep complexity, whether we procure technology or know-how from China or from the US, for any country around the world, that decision makers within organizations need to start thinking about their technology exposure maps, and that will help support the mitigation of potential destructive cyber attacks against our infrastructure, but I think more fundamentally help mitigate what are potential risks from a regulatory, a compliance, and certainly from a reputational perspective. And I will just hold off here, Marcia, if there's any questions. If not, very happy to pass on to Leandro.
Thank you, Nicolas. I have tons of questions, but I'll hold myself because we have only 10 minutes to allow Leandro, and I think he has a major role in speaking about all these risks and how they affect Brazil. Just a very quick comment then. Being on the insurance side as I am, I have seen an amazing growth of cyber threats, that this only the ones that are already covered by insurance. And not only that, the potential that they have to be really catastrophic. So what they derive in terms of loss for having that threat and taken care of, so that you get your operation back to business, and everything that can affect in terms of business and business interruption. So especially for companies, there are a lot of discussions about regulation on Facebook and other Twitter and all this about fake news. I think there's a big theme, but we could be discussing this for hours. But let's hear now, Leandro, and all your views on the top risks affecting specifically Brazil.
Thank you, Marcia. So yeah, I would like to finish the presentation by talking a bit about some specific implications for Brazil. And as Claudine mentioned, we have been dealing globally with these geopolitical rivalries and issues. And as she mentioned as well, there will be space for countries willing to operate across these, let's say, geopolitical divide, and Brazil is one of these countries. Brazil is really willing to maintain a neutral position in these global issues. Former President Jair Bolsonaro emphasized Brazil's neutrality, and current President Lula also wants, let's say, this more neutral stance. However, it also means challenges for the countries, and challenges in terms of Brazil's foreign policy and foreign trade. How will the country dodge pressures from Washington, Brussels, or Beijing amid these global tensions? Trade is a particularly important issue in Brazil. Fertilizers, in the case of Russia, or Brazil agricultural and mineral exports to China and the US as well. So lots of trade issues are connected with these, with how Brazil will handle this neutrality. But I think it's also important to mention the impacts of the war in Ukraine and of these this US-China rivalry in terms of inflation and financial volatility in the country. Brazil has been struggling with higher levels of inflation over the past few years. We had a period of deflation last year, but overall inflation has been a concern in the country, and it has to do with fuel prices and food prices, which are components of Brazilian inflation that have been directly affected by the geopolitical dynamics in Europe and China and the US. And let's say the challenges that these geopolitical issues represent in terms of inflation, they also occur amid, let's say, a challenging and uncertain context in Brazil specifically due to some political uncertainties we have been experiencing in the country, especially due to the new Lula administration and let's say the socio-economic and political context in which this the third Lula administration is operating. So although Lula doesn't have necessarily an anti-business stance, the current political situation in Brazil indeed represents, let's say, brings uncertainty and let's say increased anxiety in the business environment for a few reasons. I would highlight, for example, the tensions that we have been observing within the Lula administration between different factions in the government competing for influence and competing for space in the agenda setting of the government's policy making. In this internal dispute in the government between, for example, the Workers' Party, let's say the hardcore faction of the Workers' Party, and the more moderate elements of the ruling coalition, it has translated into uncertainty in terms of, for example, how will Lula's tax reform look like? How Lula, to what extent Lula will have the political strength to approve his tax reform in Congress? To what extent the Lula administration will be committed to fiscal responsibility? That's an issue that we have been following closely. And to what extent Lula will be willing to intervene in the economy to appease his constituency or to appease the more hardcore groups within the ruling Workers' Party. So we have been observing signs of this, let's say, policy volatility that is a direct result of this conflict within the administration. We have been observing over the past few weeks, for example, how Brazil is dealing with fuel prices. Should we should we resume taxes on fuels or not? The appointment to state-owned company Petrobras. So all of these issues, let's say, highlight they are controversial, and the fact that they are controversial highlights these complex political interactions that we have been monitoring within the Lula administration. And something else that is very important is we have been talking a lot about fuel prices in Brazil, and it also has operational and social implications. Fuel prices are directly related to, let's say, social cohesion and to possibly unrest risks in the country. So let's say in social cohesion is directly related to the operational environment. So for example, the government will discuss by the end of the year the suspension of the resumption of taxes levied on diesel, and this will be a controversial issue in Brazil because of the backlash from truck drivers. And we all know, since the experience in the traumatic experience in 2018, what truck drivers, the impact that a strike by truck drivers can have in the country. So this is a highly sensitive issue, and although the government already resumed taxation on gas, for example, diesel is going to be an issue that we must closely monitor by the end of the year. And one last point that I think it's very important, the Lula administration has been sponsoring a green rhetoric, and it has, let's say, it also fuels certainty in terms of to what extent the officials will prioritize environmental concerns or economic concerns. This is an issue that affects a range of economic sectors in Brazil, especially energy and controversial energy projects in the Amazon region, for example. So this clash between environmental and environmental concerns and energy needs or economic needs, this is something that is also going to fuel uncertainty in the country and adds complexity to the situation in the country. So we don't have much time, but if you have any questions, I'll be glad to address them.
Thank you so much, Leandro. I think we have 2 minutes to explore our last question, and I think you talked in the end about energy, and I think that is a major concern about how we're going to deal, like Claudine mentioned, this transition in energy that is globally happening. So how do you see this happening in Brazil, and specifically considering this concern with the environment, that how do you balance that, and what do you see as a trend?
Yeah, I would say that we must monitor in Brazil, let's say the political cost of investing in energy transition from the standpoint of the government. So although the Lula administration has this green rhetoric and emphasized in the campaign last year his plans to boost renewable energy sources in the country, I think there are two issues here. The first one is that the government is not willing to fully relinquish investments and stimulus to fossil fuels. The administration is committed, is willing to develop the natural gas market in Brazil. For example, thermal plants, they still provide in some parts of the country a cheaper energy than renewables. And let's say the price of energy for consumers and for population, this is going to be a key priority. So let's say more expensive energy from renewable sources, these could be undermined because of the price. Brazil is a huge country with different realities, and it includes energy needs across the country. And not all, let's say, renewable energy sources are let's say are exempt from controversy. Hydropower projects, for example, they have been really controversial, especially in northern Brazil. So this is just all of this is to say that there is a political cost in terms of really committing to energy transition, and this will likely this energy transition, the country will likely struggle with these, let's say, local political and economic realities in the country.
Well, thank you, Leandro. It's a shame we don't have more time. It's been an amazing session. And I thank you very much, our incredible speakers from Control Risks, Claudine Fry, Nicolas Reys, and Leandro Lima, and also to all the Control Risks staff and for all the support to Britcham. I also thank Britcham members and partners and other guests present for being here with us for this hour and for throwing questions and making this available. I invite everyone to access the upcoming events of the Chamber on www.britcham.com.br and to subscribe to Britcham's YouTube channel and share the link of the recording of this webinar, who is going to be there if you want to watch again. It's been a pleasure to be moderating this event. I thank you all very much, and I hope to see you soon in the next events of Britcham. Bye-bye.
Thank you.